The Compliance Perspectives podcast is sponsored by Case IQ, a global provider of whistleblowing case management and compliance solutions. Learn more at caseiq.com. Welcome to the Compliance Perspectives podcast. I'm Adam Turteltaub from the Society of Corporate Compliance and Ethics and Healthcare Compliance Association. Joining us today from Chattanooga is Marti Arvin. Marti is Vice President, Chief Compliance and Privacy Officer for Erlanger Health System. And today we're going to be talking about an interesting article she wrote for Compliance Today magazine entitled Business Associates and the Closeout Process. Marti, thanks for joining us and for writing the article. The closeout process is an important one, but doesn't often get the same attention as other parts of a business associate relationship get. What's the best way for compliance to become a part of the process for winding down an arrangement?
I think that will depend in part on the structure of the organization and what's in place already. For us, we have a contract management system. And of course, I review all contracts that have business associate agreements with them. And we have that tracked in our contract management system. So what we have done is just tied into that process. What you could do in your organization, I think, is going to depend on whether you have a similar structure or how easy it's going to be for you to be made aware that a contract is terminated or will be terminating soon, and there's a BA associated to it.
There's a good point there in trying to ensure that you're part of the normal business process, not a separate compliance process. Now, the business associate will have a great deal of PHI. How do you ensure that it is returned and not kept on their servers?
So the process that I have implemented here is tied back on giving credit to Joan Podleski, who's the privacy officer at Children's Health in Dallas. She first raised this up and shared what she was doing at the CI as part of the Privacy Officer Roundtable. And when I heard what she was doing, I brought it back here and kind of tweaked it for how we are structured. But one of the things we have done is tied into our contracting folks and said that they should alert us anytime a contract is terminated or is soon to be terminated, and there's an associated business associate agreement. Once that is triggered, then we go in and find out who the notification party is for the vendor. And we now send a letter to them that asks them several questions. So we are asking them, have you retained, created, shared, received any of our PHI? Because you can have a business associate relationship that has them accessing PHI, but they may not actually retain it or store it. And so that's our first question. If they say yes, then we ask if they will return it or destroy it. And if they destroy it, we ask them to give us their certificate of destruction. And then thirdly, if they say, well, we can't return or destroy it, we ask why. There may be very legitimate regulatory legal obligations that the vendor has to retain the data. And so, we ask them what that reason is that they can't return or destroy it. If they give us a reason that says we are legally obligated to keep it for 3 years, then what we are doing is we're putting a notation in our contract management system to extend that business associate termination date for 3 years from today. And then the intent is we will go back in 3 years and say, okay, the time has now expired. Now we want you to return our data or destroy it and give us a certificate of destruction. If the vendor tells us it's completely infeasible for us to return or destroy it ever, again, we're going to ask why, and there may again be very legitimate reasons for that, but we want to know that there's a real justification for them to retain our data. And then we're making notation of that so that we have a record that says either the vendor returned it or destroyed it, the vendor has set a specified time frame to retain it, and we're tracking that, or we know that we're not going to get our data back from the vendor because of some legitimate reason.
It's funny, it doesn't matter what the topic is in compliance, sooner or later it gets down to the importance of documenting what the decision making was and what the reasons why things are they are. So in those cases where the vendor has to hold on to the data for one reason or another, and maybe indefinitely, what should you be doing in terms of putting together controls?
Well, if you've done a business associate agreement that ties to the provisions of the rule, then in your business associate agreement, there's language that says even though the underlying service or contract is terminated, if the vendor retains your data, they continue the obligations to protect it and to secure it. So I don't know that there needs to be any changes, assuming that's in your underlying business associate agreement to begin with. Because again, if they are retaining it, there should be language in there that says they are agreeing to continue to protect it.
Could you tell us what other obligations the organization would have even after the business associate agreement expires?
I think that the covered entity needs to ensure that they get their data back or that the data is destroyed if there's a time frame set. So once that time frame has expired, our intent is to go back and say to the vendor, okay, now you need to either destroy our data and give us our certificate or return it to us. And our attempt here is obviously to ensure that we know where our data is and that we are getting it returned or destroyed when that's appropriate and feasible with the vendor. And candidly, this triggered for me, particularly in recent times, because we've dealt with 2 data compromises that were compromises by business associates. And one in particular was a business associate that we don't have a relationship with any longer, and we haven't had a relationship with for several years. We did identify that there was a regulatory obligation for them to keep the data for 3 years after the termination, but the termination had occurred more than 5 years ago. So there really was no basis for the vendor to retain our data. And if we had had this process in place 3 years after the termination, we would have reached out to them and said, please destroy or return our data. And therefore, we wouldn't have had to deal with the issues of the data compromise. And I also think that there are a significant number of vendors who don't think about this. That when the contract terminates, they don't think about should we still have this data or shouldn't we still have this data. And so if nobody's asking them, it's not something they're considering. In this particular circumstance where the contract had terminated, the vendor was a smaller vendor, and from the perspective of the industry overall, and I just don't think they had any process in place to say, we don't need this data any longer. If you're doing good data hygiene, the vendors themselves should be monitoring and tracking this as well so that they don't have data that they really shouldn't have any longer. But I think that OCR could eventually argue that as a covered entity, we haven't taken appropriate steps if we aren't ensuring that our data is returned or destroyed at the earliest possible time, or we've come to consensus that return or destruction is not feasible.
I think a lot of what's going on is we've grown so attuned to thinking of data as having so much value, and we're so loath to destroy it that we lose track of the risks there is in holding it. Finally, how do you maintain your right to audit after the BA expires, or can you?
That's a little bit of a tricky question to respond to from my perspective, only because I don't think that many organizations actually do audit BAAs, even though they might have verbiage in their agreement that they can. The verbiage that I'm used to seeing in business associate agreements would likely not retain that authority, because the verbiage I've seen, the only thing that gets retained if they keep the data is their obligation to secure it and to protect it. So I don't know that I've got a good answer for that question because I don't see a lot of covered entities doing auditing today while the relationship is ongoing, nor do I see them doing a lot of that, particularly once the contract is terminated. If you have that in your agreement, that you have the right to evaluate their protections, then I think you can make that an ongoing obligation once the underlying contract terminates. Many people in their vendor monitoring process during the relationship will reach out to the vendor on a routine basis to ensure they're keeping up with all the things that they had in place when the contract was initiated, and they've addressed any new threats that have occurred. But again, in my experience, that is most commonly at the beginning of the relationship and on some routine basis throughout the underlying relationship. But once that underlying service agreement or contract has expired, I have not seen many people go out and even ask any of those follow-up questions to their vendor about maintaining the security and the protection of the data.
Well, Marti, thank you so much for sharing your time today to share insights into this very difficult issue that's one that's probably a bit overlooked. And thank you, too, for writing about it for Compliance Today magazine. I'd like to thank all of you for taking the time to listen. I'm Adam Turteltaub from SCCE and HCCA. I hope we're able to expand your compliance perspective.